Hey everybody, it is Thursday, April 24th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. A couple things we should mark on this day. Jill, today is Holocaust Remembrance Day, marked around the world, remembering the more than 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis, in addition to their murder of other minority groups as well. I'll have more on that in today's On This Day in History.
Yes, certainly the most important of the days that we are marking today. But we also want to mention on a lighter note that it is National Scream Day.
Yes, also marked today on April 24th. Sounds silly at first, but screaming has its merits. If you talk to psychologists, medical experts, it is calming for the brain to scream. We will save your ears. We're not going to scream for you on today's podcast, but wherever you're listening to us, shout, scream, let out your stress. It is apparently healthy to do that. Jill, I've been in some workout classes where they're just like, I think there's some like devoted to like screaming and yelling, and like it's actually you feel much better after the fact, as long as you're not directing it at somebody who's like standing in front of you. Well, like, you might still feel very good about it. They will not, though.
As you learn with kids, you might feel good in the moment, but then you feel immediate regret and remorse, and it leads to nothing good.
No. And they will only then repeat it to their children.
Yeah,
and
bad cycle.
Generation on generation. It's a bad cycle.
All right, let's get to the headlines here. Is the trade war over? Well, it looks like President Trump could be blinking as the White House considers slashing tariffs on China just days after they took effect.
Don't know if it's over yet, Jill, but certainly relaxing a bit.
To the war in Ukraine, President Trump gives Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky an ultimatum. What we are learning about the terms of a potential ceasefire peace deal.
Yeah, they continue to ratchet up the pressure there. The U.S. says, make the deal, Russia and Ukraine, or we're out.
Roughly 5 million student loan borrowers who are in default here in the U.S. get ready to start paying again. We'll tell you about a new deadline put in place by the Trump administration. Overseas, India taking aim at Pakistan after a terror attack in Kashmir.
Yeah, a lot of concerns about escalation there.
Back in the U.S., wildfires in New Jersey could be the biggest in decades, with thousands forced to evacuate. And Google telling some remote workers to head back into the office at least 3 days a week. And Call Me Broadway, Carly Rae Jepsen and Lena Dunham are teaming up on a Broadway musical adaptation of 10 Things I Hate About You.
You can still make the jokes off of Call Me Maybe, huh? After all this time, Call Me Broadway, Carly Rae.
Well, I'm trying it. Did it land? I made the effort.
Listen, it's been more than a decade, but we can still go with the Call Me references.
Is she known really for anything more than that?
Well, she's hoping to with this Broadway show.
But
right?
that was such a hit. It was the hit of the summer, whatever summer it was that it came out. It's somewhere in the
I remember. I mean, not to digress too much here. We had Colin Powell, former Secretary of State, on the CBS Morning Show, and it had him sing along to Call Me Maybe. I mean, literally everyone was singing it at that moment. So
yes, to answer your question, I'm still going to do a Call Me Maybe reference.
Oh, we did it. So I hope you guys are happy with it, and you'll stick with us through the rest of this podcast, where we'll continue to make references from 2011. 2012.
and earlier. We're not stopping at 2011.
That's true. And on this day in history, we're going to take you back even further.
Moshe has On This Day in History.
Yes, I will raise Jill's Carly Rae Jepsen reference and talk about Tom Petty.
Which must be why when you logged on, you were singing Tom Petty. And I'm like, what is he singing? And then I'm like, Tom Petty. And it's all coming together. All right, let's start this podcast the same way that we have many times over the past couple of weeks with the trade war and Wall Street. But this time, quite a different story. A story that may alleviate some anxiety. In the last 24 hours, some major signs from the Trump administration that they are, in fact, watching the major sell-off on Wall Street and partially slamming the brakes on some of the tariffs announced earlier this month. On Tuesday, stocks rallied for a second day with the president and his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, softening their tone on both China and also the Federal Reserve. Here is the Treasury Secretary speaking at a finance event in Washington.
America first does not mean America alone. To the contrary, it is a call for deeper collaboration and mutual respect among trade partners.
Moshe, that is definitely talking about cooperation, working with other countries. It is not just, we are the United States of America. You guys will do this, whatever we say. The Wall Street Journal reporting that the Trump administration is actually considering slashing those steep tariffs on Chinese imports, in some cases by more than half. This would be a way to de-escalate tensions with Beijing that have roiled global trade and investment. No official word, though, from the White House on that.
No official word yet, but indications that they are considering it, and also that the markets are very happy with it. It should be said, on this roller coaster ride, it appears we're now on the downslope of the roller coaster. Just 2 months ago, the U.S. and China respectively had about 20% tariffs on each other, and then the U.S. took it to 54, and then they took it to 104, and they took it to 140, whatever where we're at this point. And then China responded accordingly. Now it looks like we're going to take them back again, just a few weeks after putting them in. One White House senior official saying the China tariffs were likely to come down to between 50 and 65%, so basically half of where they are today. They expect that China will do the same and ratchet things down here. It does look like the Trump administration is getting the pressure and feeling the pressure from Wall Street, from a number of companies, from Republicans behind the scenes who are very concerned about this, and some Republicans in front of the scenes, in front of the cameras, who are like, you better cut some deals soon because this is having real world ramifications. Jill, we're hearing from small business owners who are like, I don't know how much longer I can go here if these tariffs stay in effect. Very small margins these small companies have, small businesses have, and a lot of them dependent on China and not going to be around for however many years it takes if all the manufacturing that the administration wants moves back to the US. And even then, how much will it cost? Another important factor here, going to the markets, is the president announced in the past 24 hours he has no plans to fire the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell. He's blamed it on the media, even though Trump has been very clear that he was not happy with him, threatening the idea of firing him. He now says that he's not going to fire him. Powell has a year left as Federal Reserve Chair. Apparently, behind the scenes, there's a lot of talking to Trump saying, listen, even if you fire Powell, which, by the way, we're not even sure we legally can do over policy differences, the rest of the Federal Reserve, they all are against lowering interest rates right now, too. They're concerned about inflation regarding tariffs. So firing him ain't going to get you very far. It's only going to upset the markets and ultimately could lead to legal issues here. So it appears he has been talked down from that. Jill, the big factor here when it comes to some of these moves is in the past couple of weeks, for the first time in decades, the stock market went down, the bond market went down, the dollar lost value. I mean, basically, it was a bet against America globally. Bond market is sort of the key barometer of how people feel about America. Why? Because we issue treasury bonds. It's how the government pays for things. People buy the bonds and then are paid back years later. Well, a bunch of countries out there and our major buyers are like, yeah, we're not really going to invest in treasury bonds because the U.S. doesn't seem that stable right now, which led the bond market yields to go up, which means it was now getting more expensive for the U.S. to offer the bonds. The government was going to have to pay back more. Keep in mind, we already pay $1 trillion a year just on interest in the bonds. And so the Japanese hold a bunch of bonds, the Chinese hold a bunch of bonds. And so ultimately here, that was the barometer, that the people who typically move to bonds when the stock market goes down because it's typically more stable are like, actually, we're not moving to U.S. bonds because we don't really trust the U.S. right now. And so that was the wake-up call when he dropped the reciprocal tariffs. That appears to be the wake-up call here because the bond markets still, the yields are up, which translates to a weaker bond market. They continue to have to raise the interest rates to incentivize people to buy U.S. bonds. And this is something actually I heard yesterday. I was at the Time 100 conference. Ray Dalio, a legend of Wall Street, was talking about this with Fareed Zakaria. And he's like, we have a problem here. A lot of the major global economies are in so much debt that we have a larger, even before all of this, supply and demand problem. We're all funding our governments, funding what we need to do off of debt. We're running out of people to buy that debt. And so debt is going to become more expensive. And this is going to be a downward cycle here. And so we all need to figure out a solution quickly here. Doge doesn't appear to be making as much progress as they wanted to. They found about $160 billion in savings. They were hoping for $2 trillion in savings. And so there's larger issues here, and this tariff thing only sort of supercharged it, leading to these issues, which smart folks at the White House, like Scott Bessent at Treasury, know that when you have problems with the bond market, That is a bet against America, and that can't last very long. You got to change your policies.
We started this by saying, is the trade war over? And as we're saying, yes, it's looking like things are going to de-escalate.
Simmering. We're bringing the
They're turning the temperature down.
We're turning it to low after it was like the full boil.
But I was watching CNBC for a while on Wednesday, and one of the things that a few of the analysts were saying is that they'll know that there's real change if perhaps Peter Navarro, who's kind of the architect of this trade policy, if somehow he gets sidelined or leaves the administration, and even Howard Lutnick, two of the big names really behind this tariff policy.
It does appear that Scott Bessent, who is assuaged market concerns, has really taken the main economic spokesperson role, at least in the last week and a half. So the question is, do the two gentlemen you mentioned, Navarro and Lutnick, are they completely pushed out, or are they given sort of less of a role, less of a prominent role? Because the markets certainly don't like hearing from them. Or I should say, the things that they've been saying.
All right, now to the war in Ukraine. The Trump administration giving Ukraine an ultimatum when it comes to making peace with Russia. On Wednesday, President Trump criticized Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky for rejecting a U.S.-backed plan that would offer Russia the Ukrainian region of Crimea, which Russia illegally annexed back in 2014. Trump, writing on Truth Social, regarding Zelensky, can have peace, or he could fight for another 3 years before losing the whole country. We are very close to a deal, but the man with no cards to play should now finally get it done in all caps. The U.S. also says Russia does need to agree to a full ceasefire before entering peace negotiations. The U.S. proposal would unofficially recognize Russian control of nearly all areas occupied since the 2022 invasion. It would block Ukraine from joining NATO and also freeze territorial lines in the 3-year war, which essentially were the goals of Russian President Vladimir Putin. So the Ukrainians are viewing this proposal as very highly favorable towards Russia. Here is Vice President J.D. Vance on a trip to India being asked by reporters about the proposal.
Just to clarify, so you want the current lines of war in the war in Ukraine to remain the same under your proposal?
No, I didn't say that. What I said is the current lines, somewhere close to them, is where you're ultimately, I think, going to draw the new lines in the conflict. Now, of course, that means the Ukrainians and the Russians are both going to have to give up some of the territory they currently own. There's going to have to be some territorial swaps.
Again, there's Vice President J.D. Vance saying the ceasefire plan would essentially freeze the territory along the current front lines of the conflict, and that the U.S. would walk away if both parties don't agree.
Yes, this is a bit of the tone we were talking about last week. And the Ukrainians just don't like the deal, right? As far as they're concerned, Russia gets to keep Crimea. Russia gets to keep the 20% of the country by the size of Pennsylvania that they've taken in this war. Ukraine doesn't get to join NATO. All the sanctions are lifted on Russia, which means they can rebuild their military. Russia gets enhanced cooperation with the U.S. What does Ukraine get? Well, they get a security guarantee, but it's pretty vague, right? It's not clear exactly which European countries would be there, what Russia will accept as a peacekeeping force. Notably, the most powerful military on earth that has very much supported Ukraine until now, the U.S., will not be a part of that security guarantee. So Ukraine's like, wait, we don't get to join NATO. We don't have much of a security guarantee. Russia gets to keep a bunch of territory. What about rebuilding? It's going to be like $500 billion to rebuild Ukraine due to all the Russian damage that they've done these last few years. And there is a commitment to rebuilding here. It's not clear where they're going to get all that money and who's committing all that money. And so that's one of the Ukrainian questions here, which is like, this doesn't seem like a great deal. Now, what the Trump administration would argue is like, well, Ukraine, you're not doing very well in the war right now, so you're not going to get an amazing deal. But the Europeans, who are very much in the Ukrainians' corner, and by the way, the U.S., through the Biden administration, was very much in the Ukrainian corner. So they're still dealing with the whole shock of the Trump administration trying to be fair arbiters here and trying to strike a deal here that works for both sides. And so as far as what's going on right now, that's the deal. Trump is saying you need to take it. The Ukrainians are like, wait, we don't like this deal. Trump is trying to push them to take it. And Ukraine's very worried that, like, even if they take this deal, what's stopping Vladimir Putin from restarting the war again in a year or two or months or whatever it'll take for him to rebuild and taking even more of Ukraine here? And so that is the major concern. We should note Marco Rubio talking to the Ukrainians, Steve Witkoff, the Trump envoy, talking to Putin and the Russians here. And the administration here has had frustration with both sides, but very much in the last 24 hours, you saw Trump in particular take aim at Zelensky for what he feels is not a grasping reality here with this deal. And so we will watch in the coming days if this pressure campaign works, the role of the Europeans here, what else the U.S. might offer Zelensky, or whether Trump is actually like, no, this is take it or leave it. Otherwise, I'm out, and you guys can just keep going with your war, which will not be good for Zelensky because he's not getting the military support he once got from the U.S.
Time for the speed read from NPR. The Trump administration says that it will soon resume collections on defaulted student loans for the first time in 5 years. The Department of Ed said its Office of Federal Student Aid will resume collections on May 5th, meaning that it could start taking funds out of borrowers' tax refunds, Social Security benefits, and eventually their wages. Here is White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt talking about why the Trump administration is restarting the payments.
This is unsustainable, unfair, and a huge liability for American taxpayers. Debt cannot be wiped away. It just ends up getting transferred to others. So why should Americans who didn't go to college or went to college and responsibly paid back their loans pay for the student loans of other Americans?
The change will affect about 5.3 million borrowers who went into default before the pandemic. Technically, a borrower is considered in default when they fail to make a loan payment for at least 270 days. 8 million federal student loan borrowers are waiting for the courts to decide if their repayment plan is legal. Another 9 million are late on their payments and could be plunging toward default.
So millions of Americans impacted here. The first Trump administration, by the way, is the one that announced they would pause collections on defaulted loans. This was very early on in the pandemic back in 2020. The Biden administration, we talked about this, we covered this. They tried to forgive student loan debt a number of ways. The Supreme Court rejected it. There were multiple lawsuits. They were able to forgive loans for certain groups of people, but not the widespread student loan forgiveness that they were hoping for. So now you have the Trump administration saying, listen, the aforementioned story, we're in debt. We need our money. You're in default. It is time for you to pay. If you cannot pay or strike a deal here, we will garnish your wages. We will take whatever money we can to make you good on those student loans. Now, the argument economists would make is that the U.S. economy is very much a consumer economy. 70% of the U.S. GDP is based on consumer spending. Every dollar I'm giving back to the government on my student loan is a dollar less that I'm spending on the economy, buying things in the stores, going to restaurants. It's less money circulating. Now, the government here, the Trump administration is arguing, well, but they owe us, and this should go to the government. So that's the nature of the debate here. But ultimately, as of May 5th, it appears they will be, demanding that money back, sort of like we had the situation before March of 2020. And they do say that anyone who is potentially in default here or verging on default will get a letter from the government. And I guess you can call. We heard from somebody, Jill, who was on hold for 5 hours trying to get through to somebody to talk to the Department of Education about their situation. So if you're dealing with this, please alert us to your situation. You can email us over at info@mo.news, info@mo.news.
Heading overseas from the New York Times, India announced a number of measures targeting Pakistan on Wednesday, a day after suspected militants killed 26 men at a tourist destination in Kashmir. It was the worst attack on civilians in the country in nearly 2 decades. India has shut down the border, pulled back diplomats, and canceled visas for some Pakistanis. Islamic terrorists opened fire on a group of tourists in the Indian-administered northern region of Kashmir. The attack took place in a picturesque Himalayan district that is popular with Indian travelers and that locals often call a mini Switzerland. It is the worst assault against civilians in the region in years. In a social media post, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi condemned the terror attack and said that those behind this heinous act will be brought to justice.
So no specific group has officially claimed responsibility for this, but it's long been a place where Islamic extremists associated with Pakistan or loyal to Pakistan who don't think India should have that land have conducted attacks. Jill, this is the worst attack in years. You can go back a number of years, but back in 2019, there was an attack in this region. It did lead to some back and forth between the two countries. At the time, India carried an airstrike out after an attack on Pakistan. Pakistan then returned fire, and then Indian jets responded again before there was de-escalation. One of the things to keep in mind here is that these two countries effectively had multiple wars since 1947. They're both nuclear powers as well. So anytime there's escalation here that is of particular concern, and in this case, we should note that those in that terror attack that happened a couple days ago, they specifically tried to kill Hindus. These were Islamic extremists who were calling out and specifically trying to kill Hindus based on reporting on the ground there. So it was very clear what their goals were here. And again, this goes way back, just to give you guys history and context like we like to do on the podcast. Right around the time the British were splitting up the Palestinian mandate between the Jews and the Arabs, they were doing the same with India between the Hindus and the Muslims. And so India and Pakistan come out of that split, and Kashmir has always been disputed territory there on the northern border. And so there's Pakistan-administered Kashmir, Indian-administered Kashmir. They fought a couple of wars over the region as well. There's going to be a lot of pressure here on Modi, the leader of India, to fight back. He's got a lot of right-wingers. He's got a lot of people who are very upset about this. This is the worst terror attack in the country in a number of years. How he responds will be very interesting. Modi cut short a trip to the Middle East, returned to India. J.D. Vance happens to be there as well, negotiating a trade agreement right now. And so we'll see what comes of that. But it's a full docket here. I wonder if Steve Witkoff will have to add this to his agenda. He's already been given Hamas and Israel. He's been given Ukraine and Russia. He's been given Iran. So he's, like Trump will call Witkoff and be like, hey, listen, you're in the neighborhood anyway. Can you go fly over to New Delhi and Islamabad and deal with that situation?
When we hear he's brokering talks between Drake and Kendrick Lamar, that would be peak Witkoff priorities.
Yeah, he's got to do Blake Lively and Baldoni, too. That's a situation that needs de-escalation.
From NBC News, a massive wildfire continued to burn in New Jersey on Wednesday, spanning about 12,000 acres. 5,000 people were evacuated. Traffic was at a standstill. Huge plumes of black smoke billowed into the sky. The fire is fueled by strong 25-mile-per-hour gusts that whipped through the area. As of Wednesday, the fire was about 30% contained. The cause of the fire, though, still under investigation. And Moshe, here in New York, if you have noticed, the air quality not so great thanks to that smoke making its way over to this area.
Yeah, Jill, it's been interesting that, in recent months, we've been reporting on these East Coast wildfires, but there have been these long-term drought conditions across the East Coast, not as much rain and snow as we typically get in the past few months. And so that's led to these situations. We reported on that wildfire in North Carolina and South Carolina, and now just the latest fire here in the Northeast.
From CNBC, 5 years after the onset of the COVID pandemic, Google is demanding that some remote workers return to the office if they want to keep their jobs and avoid being part of broader cost cuts at the company. Several units within Google have told remote staff that their roles could be at risk if they don't start showing up at the closest office for a hybrid work schedule. Some of those workers, by the way, previously approved for remote work. But as the pandemic slips further into the rearview mirror, more companies are tightening their restrictions on remote work, forcing some staffers who moved to distant locations to reconsider their priorities if they want to maintain their employment. That was a very big thing, if you remember, especially for some of those tech companies, people who were working in San Francisco and paying very high San Francisco rent said, wait, if I'm going to do this from home anyway, I just want to move back to Montana or wherever it is that I came from and pay a lot less.
Yeah. When Montana cost less, and then so many people moved out there, Idaho, etc. It got super expensive out there. But people changed their lives around this, expecting that this would be the reality for the foreseeable future. Now, increasingly, you have financial firms, tech companies, the U.S. government, a variety of sectors here who have said, actually, we need people back in the office. Productivity is not as high. Now, in certain areas, in certain roles, certainly you have companies that are saying, wherever you work, if you work in a certain sector that doesn't require in-person work, we're okay with that. But then you have others who are like, nonetheless, we feel that we need people back in the office. It is about time. They are considering these hybrid situations, which is a few days a week. But again, for people who have changed their lives, taken their kids to new places, new schools, living hundreds of miles away or several states away, that, is one of the challenges here as these companies make these calls. But it appears now the trajectory continues to be in that direction, which is come back to the office at least a few days a week.
And finally, some entertainment news from Billboard. When romantic comedy 10 Things I Hate About You was released back in 1999, it was a watershed pop cultural moment, cementing the star power of actors like Heath Ledger, Julia Stiles, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
Remember peak Julia Stiles? There was like a moment in time when like Julia Stiles was like in every movie for about 2 years.
And then nothing. Right?
And then we did she had that there was the Julia Stiles moment.
Well, nearly 30 years later, Broadway audiences will see if that magic can be recaptured on stage. 10 Things I Hate About You is being adapted as a musical. Singer-songwriter Carly Rae Jepsen will co-write the score, and Lena Dunham of Girls will be co-writing the book with award-winning playwright Jessica Huang.
So a little background here. 10 Things I Hate About You was a retelling of Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. So Shakespeare, by the way, we've been talking about Shakespeare this week, because it was his birthday, right? Yesterday, allegedly, is a 1594 play. And so 10 Things I Hate About You took that play from 1594, Taming of the Shrew, and took it to the Seattle suburbs of the 90s for the purposes of that film. So it'll be interesting here, Jill, for the purposes of the Broadway show in 2025, 2026. They haven't announced exactly when the opening date is yet, what they do for Broadway purposes. But pretty remarkable that like this storyline or version of the storyline continues to live on and on here. Lena Dunham involved. We should note that she has a Netflix series, Too Much, out later this year. She is writing a film about Sam Bankman-Fried as well, and is also directing a rom-com starring Natalie Portman. So Lena Dunham, very busy here in addition to this play. Now, as for Carly Rae Jepsen, Call Me Maybe, Call Me Broadway, she did play Cinderella in 2014. She played Frenchie in Grease Live on Fox. Remember that a few years ago when they were doing the live performances of various classic shows? And so it's an interesting group here. Carly Rae, Lena Dunham, a version of a Shakespeare play turned hit film. So definitely something to look forward to on Broadway, Jill. We had a chance, I think I told folks last week, what I was watching was the George Clooney show, Good Night and Good Luck, on Broadway. Much more serious, not a musical. Edward R. Murrow, taking down Joseph McCarthy. But we saw that performance last week, and my wife Alex and I were like looking around, like, what else should we be seeing on Broadway? And so this is definitely something we'll consider.
Okay, great, and we'll look forward, Moshe, to your review.
Well, they still haven't announced the theater it's going to be in, and there's only like a dozen plus theaters that are like Broadway theaters. So they have to find an available theater and then do a date. So
not to harp on Call Me Maybe, but they should figure out a way to work it
Jill, in. Like this was you need to put this on your running mix.
Like move
your
on.
Workout mix. I bet you it's probably already on your. Is it on your workout
Obviously.
mix? Obviously.
Duh.
All right, that brings us to On This Day in History. Jill discovered Call Me Maybe. And on this day in 1800, the Library of Congress was officially founded as President John Adams approved $5,000 to acquire, quote, such books as may be necessary for the use of Congress. Literally the Library of Congress. It would eventually become the largest library in the world. It would be burned down by the British in the War of 1812 when the Brits tried to come back and take us again. After that, President Jefferson, or I should say at that point, former President Thomas Jefferson, donated his collection to the library to restart the library again. That was about 6,000 books that he had out there in Monticello, Virginia, that he donated to the Library of Congress to start it up again. Okay, as we mentioned at the top of the podcast, today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. It corresponds to the date on the Hebrew calendar when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising took place. This is the summer of 1942. 300,000 Jews were deported from Warsaw, Poland to the Treblinka death camp. When reports of mass murder started to hit the Warsaw Ghetto, the group that was left, the remaining 35,000 Jews or so, decided to stage an organized uprising, saying, if they're going to send us to a death camp anyway, at least we need to fight back. They were able to drive back the Nazis. The uprising lasted 27 days there in the Warsaw Ghetto. They were able to organize a bit of a resistance there, smuggle in some arms into the ghetto, last 27 days. But tragically, the Nazis would defeat the uprising. All right, a couple more items here before we go. On this day in 1996, the WNBA was founded. On this day in 1997, Jill, Seinfeld history for you. Georgia's new girlfriend on today's episode in history uses yada, yada, yada to shorten her stories.
Moshe, was a classic episode, and I have to say, a very useful tool if you don't really want to explain a full story, to just kind of be like, yada, 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 and then cut to the end.
Yada, yada, yada. The tariffs are still there. Yada, yada, yada. We really could shorten this podcast with some yada yadas, Jill.
We should try it. Like on a
So
Friday.
there's like the regular edition, then yada yada edition. And like, you guys taught me nothing today. You just yada yada through the speed read. I'm like, we did. Because we wanted to get to what we're watching, reading, and eating this weekend. Back to On This Day in History, yada yada yada. A whole bunch of other things happened on April 24th in history, but I'll end with Tom Petty. He released his debut solo album, On This Day in History, Full Moon Fever, on this day 36 years ago.
All right. Thank you guys for listening to the Mo News podcast. Yada, yada, yada. Please review us in the App Store.
Yada,
we
yada.
appreciate it.
You know the reason why. Yada, yada, yada. Join Mo News Premium. Yada, yada. What are you waiting for? Jill, have a great day. I'll see you back here tomorrow.
Yada.
Yada and yada.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.